Joining me now is my friend, former Chief of Staff to House Speaker John Boehner and Senior Advisor to President George W. Bush. It is Barry Jackson, and this is his first podcast, and I am honored. So Barry, welcome to Perino on Politics. This is the show where I call up my smart friends. I say, what's going on? What do you think? And you are one of my smartest friends. Just for background purposes, so that people know, I don't even know if you'll remember this, Barry, but I started on Capitol Hill in August of 1995 for Congressman Scott McInnes. And I worked there answering phones for 6 weeks. And then I took over as the press secretary for Congressman Dan Schaefer, Dan, not Bob Schaefer, of Colorado, who was good friends with your boss, John Boehner. And there was John Kasich at the time. I mean, I loved my job on Capitol Hill so much. I loved it. And I still have good friends from there. And I have, of course, aspired to be a part of the Boehner world. And I feel like I kind of got adopted in. What do you think?
Well, absolutely. And I had forgot the Scott McInnes part. I always remember you first from Dan Schaefer. And we ran the conference, which was the comms operation. And because you were the press secretary, you were part of our family. And
I love the comms operation. You guys did such a great job.
Yeah.
Do you think you would have done a better job with social media, or do you think it was better to not have it?
So I'm a Luddite. I think social media makes it much harder because I feel social media disrupts the connection between policy and politics, which is what comms' job is to bridge the two of those things. And
that's why I love it.
Yeah. But I think social media makes that really difficult because the amount of data that's out there and self-selection, it gets very hard.
And then after I left Capitol Hill, you left Capitol Hill, we meet again and at the Bush White House. And you were in Rove world. I was in the comms shop and press secretary world. But what's interesting, Barry, is we just did an interview on America's Newsroom with Chris Wright and Doug Burgum. That's the Secretary of Energy and Secretary of the Interior. And they were in Alaska. And they're there to talk about how the Trump administration is going to reopen this pipeline. And I was like, wow, everything that is new is old, or everything that's old is new again, right? Because these were the same fights we've been having forever. And maybe we start there on just your overall thinking about some of the arguments that people are still having regarding the budget, the deficit, and especially the economy. Lots of things have changed, but in a way, some of these fights are still the same.
Yeah, they are, Dana. I think it's a great observation. And it gets back to me this challenge in governing today, which is that the political side of the equation is almost solely worried about winning elections, and the policy is somewhat irrelevant. On the policy side, you're trying to build a majority, trying to explain to people why we need to take this sometimes unpleasant task. And that break really bothers me. And if you remember in our days working together, the policy shop always thought I was a political geek. The political guys always thought I was a policy nerd. And I'll give you an example of this. When I went back to John Boehner's office after the White House and getting ready for the 2010 election, our base as Republican voters, we have to repeal Obamacare. And so our political consultants were like, we need to run a campaign, we're going to repeal Obamacare. And I was like, I'm sorry, excuse me. Harry Reid is the Democratic leader of the Senate. Even if we pass a bill, do you think he's going to bring it up? And even if he did bring it up, do you think enough Democrat senators will get it over the margin? And even if they do you think Barack Obama is going to sign a bill to overturn his signature accomplishment? So we're promising our voters something that is impossible to do. Right. Well, they'll blame the Democrats. I'm like, no, we're the ones that made the promise. They're going to blame us. And I just look today and I see that time and time again.
Well, yeah, because you get it back into that whole thing of like, well, Republicans don't fight.
Right.
But it's like you have to fight smart.
Exactly.
Fight harder, you have to fight smarter. And maybe you could talk about how that moment of leaving the Bush White House, we were there together for the financial crisis. You go back to Capitol Hill. Now Obama is president and the Tea Party rises up. And can you draw a fairly straight line from the Tea Party to where we are today politically?
100%. Yeah, 100%. And And I would say that the line goes even farther back. It was the first midterm election for Bill Clinton, where voters thought that President
was
Clinton
94.
was doing something different. Yeah, 94.
And that swept in my future boss, Scott McInnes. Okay.
100%. And their things were President Clinton's raising taxes, he's spending too much money, he's not doing the stuff he said he was going to do. So you go forward in 2010, same kind of level of anger. Barack Obama was not the guy that everybody thought he was. Now, if you paid attention to him, he campaigned and said exactly what he was going to do, but that's not what people were hearing. So the Tea Party thing, I remember Boehner would constantly suggest to members, you need to go home and you need to do Tea Party events. But here's the deal. Don't go up on stage and start giving a speech. Sit in the back of the room and actually listen to them. Because what you'll find is a genuine concern and a lack of appreciation of what we're going through. And it's we being the elected side. And it's not that you want them to feel sorry for us or they elected us to do the tough jobs. But part of your job of being a member of Congress is not how many retweets you get, not how many hits you get on Dana's show. It's I have to go back and sometimes tell my constituents, here's the tough choices we have to make. And I want to talk to you about those. And I think we do entirely too little of that today.
And one of those tough decisions is about how do we deal with America's finances. You write about this a lot in your current several roles that you have, all the different hats, but you pay a lot of attention to this. And back in 2005, we've talked about this on Perino on Politics before, there was an effort under George W. Bush in the second term, first right out of the gate, wanted to figure out a way to do a modest reform of Social Security to allow people the option. I mean, if you start thinking about the adjectives that we use and you think, why was everyone so against that? Because when it finally does get solved, and it will have to get solved at some point, it will look a lot like what was proposed in '05, I believe, unless it has to be much more drastic. So let's fast forward. And now we're in the present, and President Trump has very narrow margins of majorities in the House and the Senate. He wants to get the big, beautiful bill done. It does not include any reforms to Medicare or Social Security, modest slowing of the growth of rate of increase for Medicaid, but that will be a big sticking point. Republicans, ever since time began, since I've been a part of communications, never figured out a really good way to talk about this. And I was reading the papers over the weekend, and I see Republican leadership still using the same type of language, like we're not cutting Medicaid. You know, they keep answering that question. I'm not saying I have a better answer, but the nation's finances are what they are because nobody wants to deal with this issue. And even if the big, beautiful bill passes, we're still not going to deal with it.
Right. And I it's interesting the way you frame that up, Dana, because I think about this moment and where a lot of, however you frame establishment conservatives or, non-MAGA Republicans, however, that most of their challenge, I think, with President Trump is style versus policy. And I want to pull back a lens and say that it is possible that there's a method to this madness and that the reconciliation bill is existential for Republicans. It is going to pass. What exactly it's going to look like, don't know for sure, but it's not going to be too far off from what the House passed. Once that's done, it clears the decks of so many different things and sets up a foundation that maybe the president can say, look, you put me in office because you knew things were broke. You thought I was going to tear things up. I'm doing the best I can. Now I want to turn to a couple really big issues that we have to talk about. Now, that may be silly on my part, but I want to have that kind of hope because all the types of things both Republicans and Democrats profess that they want to get done for the American people, ultimately, if we don't get the financial house in order, it's impossible to be done.
Yeah, it's like asking all of these young Americans to run a triathlon with 20-pound weights on their ankles.
Yeah.
And not complain about it. Like,
which
hey, if you walk to school uphill both ways, you can do it. What about tariffs? The president thinks that this is a great tool. Maybe it is. I don't know. I'm against it. I've been against it from the beginning. But I understand where he's coming from in terms of especially China. I understand that. But now it's all tied up in the courts. And what's happened is where you and I used to work on Capitol Hill, there's just a complete abdication of any sort of lawmaking. So now we're in a tennis match and the ball's in the president's court. And then it's in the judicial branch. And then it's back to the executive branch and the judicial branch. And we don't get a lot of clarity because the legislative branch is out getting a beer.
Yeah, and in preparation for this, I listened to your last podcast. I did because I wanted to, not embarrass you, and so I listened to your last podcast with our mutual friend Trey Gowdy, and you were making this point, and I think it's really valid. Is that as much as we want to, as Republicans, complain about what Barack Obama and Joe Biden did, and Democrats about what George Bush and Donald Trump have done are doing, the simple fact is Congress has abdicated its responsibilities. And even with the recent what's called the Chevron decision, which the Supreme Court said we're not going to empower the executive branch quite as much anymore. Mm-hmm. That's just a small piece of the pie. Oversight hearings, writing language that is just so vague. And you think about a federal court judge who may be sitting there with 2-3 law clerks is all of a sudden supposed to decide, is a billionth of a particle or a millionth of a particle the correct standard? Right. Because Congress deferred that decision to a bunch of careers. I was like, how are we supposed to figure that out?
Right. I would say go back and show your work.
Yeah.
As they say. Can I ask you just a couple of international questions? We saw a lot yesterday. So we're recording this on Monday, June 2nd. Yep. And on Sunday, it was almost amazing to watch. Not just almost amazing. It was amazing to watch, but it was almost like if you went back in time and were to watch the Trojan horse. Yeah. Because Ukraine was able to get these drones, about $600 each, these drones. And they got them into Russia and they destroyed 39 fighter jets of the Russians, which I'm sure these fighter jets probably cost, $15-20 million to make a piece. And a $600 drone destroys them. I mean, we are entering a new wave of warfare. And the Ukrainians and the Russians are fighting. They're having ceasefire talks today. I put that in quotes for people listening because everyone's going to the table for ceasefire discussions, still determined to fight. Right.
So here's my first thought about that. One was unabashedly, I believe in freedom and democracy and what's going on in Ukraine. Dana, you and I had this shared experience with President Bush in that region. So I was thrilled by what happened. But the next thing, what came to my mind was, and it goes back to this Trump issue of style versus big picture. Your former colleague is now the Secretary of Defense, and a lot of people pay a ton of attention to him. There are two other choices that President Trump made. Dan Driscoll as Secretary of the Army and Steve Feinberg as Deputy Secretary. And these two gentlemen, long history dealing with the defense community. And what they're focused on is DOD is prepping for buying weaponry for wars that we are not going to fight anymore.
Right.
And you may remember, President Bush's first Defense Secretary, Don Rumsfeld, before 9/11, the reason he was brought in was we need to turn the Pentagon upside down and get prepared. And so you think about now, and this gets back to Congress's role in all of this. Congress forces DOD to buy weapons and military equipment that the Defense Department doesn't want and doesn't need. But it's the issue of jobs and, it's made in my district and all that type of thing. And if this drone attack, because it's not only just the technology, but if you think about it, able to sneak trucks with drones, with people on the ground into Russia and be able to communicate back and forth without the Russians ever even knowing about that. Now, all of a sudden, you start thinking about what President Trump talks about our own borders and the porousness of our borders.
Yeah.
There's a big picture to all of this that you want somebody to stand back and just tell the American people, look, there's something going on, and here's what I want to tell you about. And I would make this argument. It's self-serving, but President Bush was the last person in the United States who I think consistently and his team went out to the American people and said, I know what we're doing seems costly and it's cost us blood and treasure, but this is why America does what it does.
Right. He was determined to always talk and explain. And I always thought about that with Biden. Like, why don't they ever explain anything? Well, now I guess because he couldn't. But one thing, last point on this before we go to the next block, where I do want to talk about Democrats and a little bit more raw politics. But when it comes to Ukraine, I always go back to the fact that I feel like the Biden administration gets off really easy here in terms of history, because they said they wanted Ukraine to win, but then they would tie one hand behind their back and not give them what they said was coming. And they dribbled it out. And so the American people lost patience and interest, and frustration grew because of the cost. But also, they didn't give Ukraine what they needed initially. So now we're still at this point. General Keane explained today that Russia and Ukraine now have been fighting for longer than America fought in World War II.
Right.
And we're nowhere near the end.
You are spot on about this. And, you and I both know men and women who volunteered, went and served Iraq and Afghanistan. That generation came back as war fighters who knew what the changes were on the battlefield, and brass doesn't listen to them as much. And that's what happened, I think, during the Biden term. They had different focuses on what their foreign policy priorities were, and they just couldn't wrap their head around the notion of Putin doing what he was doing and that he had other aims.
Right.
And it's going to cost us in the long run treasure, and I hope not blood, but in trying to set things right. And I don't mean like putting U.S.-style democracy around the world. It's that it is protecting American interests. And the first line of defense is not our borders, but it's other countries who are aligned with us.